It was the first Sunday of the month, Thanksgiving Sunday. The air buzzed with energy. Wealthy families came in with perfumes, designer suits, and convoy cars. But one woman came differently. Madame Grace. She was new in town, a tired old widow with a wrinkled face, but eyes full of faith. She had buried her husband just 3 months ago. After years of struggling to care for him, with all she had, she decided to thank God for giving her strength to survive the storm. She wore her only black wrapper neatly tied around her thin waist. Her blouse had holes but was carefully ironed. In her hands were 2 small dry tubers of yam, her Thanksgiving seed. She arrived at the church early, even before the choir. But as she tried to sit at the front row, the usher stopped her. "Madam, you can't sit here." But I came early," she said softly. The priest gave strict instructions. "Please go to the back." With a quiet sigh, she turned and walked slowly to the back row. She didn't complain. She just smiled gently, humming a worship song under her breath. When it was time for Thanksgiving, names of wealthy families were called out first. They came with baskets of fruit, bundles of cash, goats, sound systems. The priest beamed and danced with them, placing his hands on their heads in prayer. Then Madame Grace's name was whispered by one of the assistants. A small figure stepped forward. All eyes turned. Her dry yams shook gently in her hands as she walked toward the altar. Father Frank froze. His smile disappeared. "What is this?" he said aloud, pointing at her tubers. "Are you here to thank God or poison him?" The church laughed. "This woman must be a witch," he thundered. 2 dried yams. "Is this a sacrifice or a joke?" Madame Grace said nothing. Her hands trembled. Her eyes watered. "Get out of here!" Father Frank screamed. "Take your poison with you." The laughter echoed through the cathedral as she turned slowly and walked out. Her head bowed. Even the ushers giggled. No one helped her. No one defended her. Outside the church, Madame Grace fell to her knees. "Oh, God," she whispered. "Did I come to thank you, only to be cursed?" She wiped her tears with the edge of her wrapper and tried to cross the street, but her hands were shaking. Her legs gave way. A truck horn blared, tires screeched, and the world went silent. The air was still that Sunday morning with golden sunlight pouring through cracked rooftops of the small village homes. In one of the oldest mutis, a young boy named Frank sat barefoot on the floor, watching his father polish his worn-out shoes. The scent of dust mixed with old oil filled the air as the father prepared to attend their local church, one of the only places in town where people still wore their best, even in poverty. "Papa," Frank asked, eyes wide and curious, "why do people bring food and money to church?" His father looked up and smiled faintly, tightening his frayed belt. "It's Thanksgiving, my son. We bring gifts to thank God for what He has done for us. But how do the yams and rice and chickens get to God? He lives in heaven, right?" The old man chuckled, rubbing his beard. "Well, it doesn't go up. The Reverend Father decides what to do with them. It all belongs to him." A flicker of understanding, no ambition passed through young Clement's eyes. That moment, quiet as it seemed, planted a seed that would one day bloom into something dangerous. That day at church, Frank couldn't stop staring. Bags of rice, crates of drinks, roasted goats, and bundles of cash were laid before the altar. The priest barely spoke of God. He was too busy collecting the gifts with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Frank watched the whole scene like a movie. The priest didn't look hungry. He looked powerful, worshipped, wealthy. Frank clenched his fists at his sides and whispered to himself, "One day, I will become a priest, and I will never be poor again." Years later, the boy became a man. The man became a priest. Reverend Father Frank was now known across the city for his eloquent sermons, long flowing robes, and mysterious connection with prosperity. Church members called him Papa in reverence and no one dared question his authority. His church was a cathedral built from donations of wealthy families. Marble floors, golden pulpit, imported pews. But something was off. Father Frank didn't like poor people. He hated the smell of poverty, the look of patched-up clothes, the voices that trembled when they asked for help. They reminded him too much of who he used to be and who he vowed never to become again. At his church, only the rich could sit in front. If your dress wasn't elegant or your car wasn't shiny, the ushers would direct you to the back or worse, outside. During offering time, he would walk around with a golden microphone, announcing who gave the highest. Brother Charles gave N 1 million today, he'd shout. The crowd would roar in admiration. Papa is connected. Some would say, he prays and money comes, others would whisper, but there were murmurs too. Murmurs from those who left the church hurt. Judged or rejected. They called it the rich man's church. A place of pride, not prayer. Then came the day everything began to fall apart. It was the first Sunday of the month, Thanksgiving Sunday. The air buzzed with energy. Wealthy families came in with perfumes, designer suits, and convoy cars. But one woman came differently. Madame Grace. She was new in town, a tired old widow with a wrinkled face but eyes full of faith. She had buried her husband just a month ago after years of struggling to care for him. With all she had, she decided to thank God for giving her strength to survive the storm. She wore her only black wrapper neatly tied around her thin waist. Her blouse had holes but was carefully ironed. In her hands were 2 small dry tubers of yam, her Thanksgiving seed. She arrived at the church early, even before the choir. But as she tried to sit at the front row, the usher stopped her. "Madam, you can't sit here." But I came early," she said softly. The priest gave strict instructions. "Please go to the back." With a quiet sigh, she turned and walked slowly to the back row. She didn't complain. She just smiled gently, humming a worship song under her breath. When it was time for Thanksgiving, names of wealthy families were called out first. They came with baskets of fruit, bundles of cash, goats, sound systems. The priest beamed and danced with them, placing his hands on their heads in prayer. Then Madame Grace's name was whispered by one of the assistants. A small figure stepped forward. All eyes turned. Her dry yams shook gently in her hands as she walked toward the altar. Father Frank froze. His smile disappeared. "What is this?" he said aloud, pointing at her tubers. "Are you here to thank God or poison him?" The church laughed. "This woman must be a witch," he thundered. 2 dried yams. "Is this a sacrifice or a joke?" Madame Grace said nothing. Her hands trembled, her eyes watered. "Get out of here!" Father Frank screamed. "Take your poison with you." The laughter echoed through the cathedral as she turned slowly and walked out. Her head bowed. Even the ushers giggled. No one helped her. No one defended her. Outside the church, Madame Grace fell to her knees. "Oh, God," she whispered. "Did I come to thank you? Only to be cursed." She wiped her tears with the edge of her wrapper and tried to cross the street, but her hands were shaking. Her legs gave way. A truck horn blared, tires screeched, and the world went silent. She was gone. The next day, her story spread like wildfire. Old widow humiliated at church dies hours later. God's house or fashion parade. Rich man's priest rejects poor widow's offering. Christians wept, others mocked. Some stopped going to church. Unbelievers finally had something to say. "That's why I don't go to church." Hypocrites. But Father Frank remained unfazed. "God deserves the best," he said boldly during his sermon. "And poor people don't belong at the front." He didn't know it yet, but his kingdom was crumbling. Father Clement's attitude towards the poor continued and non-stop. It's been clear from the moment he became a priest. It was as if he had built an invisible wall between himself and those who didn't have money. His favorite phrase was, "God deserves the best." What he really meant was that he deserved the best. And if you couldn't provide it, then you didn't belong near him. Another Thanksgiving Sunday, an elderly woman, Madame Agatha, known in the neighborhood for her humble spirit and small shop selling dried fish, brought a bundle of dried fish to the altar during the Thanksgiving ceremony. It wasn't much, but it was all she had. When she reached the pulpit, holding her gift carefully, Father Frank glanced at her from the corner of his eye, the expression on his face twisted with disdain. He stopped the service for a moment and called her out. "Madame Agatha," he said with a mock smile. "Are you here to bring God fish or to feed us?" He gestured to the congregation, who started laughing. "Did you think this place was a marketplace? Take your dried fish and go back to your little corner where it belongs. This is not a place for small gifts." The congregation laughed harder. Madame Agatha stood frozen, her heart heavy with shame. Her hands trembled as she clutched the fish to her chest. But she had no choice but to return to her seat, her face flushed with humiliation. Right from that moment, she made a decision to stop attending church altogether, believing she had no place in a place meant for worship. The shame from that day stayed with her for weeks. It was time for offering, and everybody lined up to drop their offerings. In the offering bowl at the altar, a poor man named Tunda, who worked as a mechanic, came to church with the little money he had earned that week. He carefully tucked Asmal and 100 note into the offering bowl, hoping to give something to God. As he walked up the aisle, the priest spotted him. "Look at this one," Father Frank said loudly, causing the entire congregation to turn toward Tun mechanic, who thinks he can give me in 100. Do you think God needs this kind of offering? Take your change and leave. If you cannot offer anything more, you're wasting your time here. The congregation snickered, and Tunda stood still, mortified. He had worked hard for every naira he earned, but it didn't matter. To Father Clement, his offering wasn't enough. Tunda stood there for a long time, not knowing what to do. His face burned with embarrassment. He wanted to leave, but he stayed out of respect for God. Slowly, he returned to his seat, his eyes lowered. Feeling unworthy of being there. It was the Youth Sunday celebration. A young university student, Bola, was invited to church by his friend for the first time. He was wearing a simple but neat t-shirt and a pair of faded jeans. He had saved up for weeks to buy a new pair of shoes. But they weren't flashy or expensive. He sat quietly at the back, hoping to learn about God. Father Frank noticed him immediately. He scowled and walked over to the microphone. "Who let this young man in here looking like a street beggar?" he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "Is this what you call coming to worship God? Wearing jeans and t-shirts like you're heading to a market. This is a church, not a nightclub." He then pointed to Bola, who tried to shrink in his seat. "Please do not sit in front. Go to the back. You're distracting others. Go and change before you come back here to give God his due honor." Bola sat still, his heart sinking. But he couldn't do anything. He had never been so humiliated in his life. It was time for seed sowing, a regular routine in the church. A single mother named Florence, who had just come back from the hospital after a difficult delivery, brought her son with her to church. Florence barely had money for food, much less offering, but she scraped together N200, which she gave with a hopeful heart. Father Frank took the offering and paused. He looked at the N200 note for a long moment, as if weighing it. "Look at this," he muttered loudly enough for the whole congregation to hear. "A woman with a baby comes here to give God an E200. God didn't ask for your crumbs. I hope you know this isn't what he wants." Florence's eyes filled with tears. Her shoulders slumped as she walked back to her seat, completely broken. Several people, including church elders and a few well-meaning members, tried to approach Father Frank about his behavior. They saw the hurt he was causing, but were too afraid to speak out. However, a few brave souls did muster the courage to have a conversation with him. Elder Stephen, a long-serving member of the church, approached Father Frank one afternoon after service. His face was stern but compassionate. "Father Clement," he began, "I've been a member of this church for over 30 years, and I've watched you closely. You've done so much good for this community, but we've seen how you treat the poor. We've seen how you humiliate them, embarrass them in front of the congregation." Father Clement's expression tightened. "What are you talking about, Elder?" he said dismissively. "I'm just teaching them how to respect God properly. If they want to bring something to the altar, they should bring their best." "Your words are causing pain, Father," Elder Stephen said softly. "We don't chase away the poor. We don't humiliate them. God doesn't measure us by the size of our offerings or the clothes we wear. You're hurting the spirit of the church." Father Frank scoffed. "I do what's best for this church. If you can't see that, then maybe you should leave." The elder stood in silence for a moment, then walked away, shaking his head. "I tried." 2 weeks later, another member, Sister Margaret, a kind woman with a soft voice, asked to speak with the priest. She had always respected him, but had begun to feel uncomfortable with the way things were going. "Father Clement," she began gently, "I have noticed the way you speak to some of our members, especially those who don't have much. I know your intentions might be good, but it's becoming too much. People are leaving the church because they feel unloved." Father Frank turned, his eyes narrowing. "What are you trying to say, sister? Are you implying that I'm wrong for wanting the best for God's house?" "I'm not saying you're wrong," Sister Margaret replied. "But we can't use God's house to shame people. The poor are just as important to God as the rich. They deserve love, not judgment." Father Clement's face re-eamed. "If you want to coddle them, then perhaps you should start your own church. But this is my house, and I do what's necessary for it to grow." Sister Margaret sighed and left, knowing it was useless. She watched as more and more members walked away in silence. The church slowly turning into a place of competition and greed. Rain fell gently outside the tinted windows of a black SUV, blurring the world into watercolored streaks. Inside, silence reigned. The only sound was the soft beeping of a heart. Monitor connected to the man in the back seat, Chief Baymadal Okono. Billionaire, oil mogul, and self-made tycoon, sat staring blankly at the file in his hands. The doctor's words echoed in his ears like Abel that refused to fade. "Stage 4 cancer, sir. It's terminal." He had heard that phrase before on TV, in movies. But now it was real. His time was ticking. Months, maybe weeks, alone in the world. No children, no wife. Everyone around him wanted something from him. His money, his name, his connections. But no one truly cared about his soul. "What's left?" he whispered to himself, his voice barely audible over the rain. His secretary, a quiet, observant young man named Daniel, sat beside him. "Sir, maybe we can use what time you have left to do something meaningful, something that will outlive you." Chief Madal nodded slowly. "Yes, I want to give back to God, to people before I leave this world. Not another yacht, not another building, something eternal." Daniel cleared his throat. "We've been researching good churches and orphanages, places that could use a donation." "Forget the mega churches," the chief interrupted. "I want to find a church that truly serves God. One that helps the poor, not the proud. A place where people are healed, not humiliated." Daniel hesitated. "There's one church in town everyone talks about," he said cautiously. "Huge cathedral, richest in the city, but the rumors about the priest." "Let's go there," the chief said suddenly. "Today, but sir, I want to see it with my own eyes. No appointments, no recognition. I'll disguise myself. Let's see if their love for God includes strangers and the poor." Back at the church, Reverend Father Frank stood proudly at the altar, his robe embroidered with golden crosses and tiny diamonds. He spoke not of sin or salvation, but of status and sacrifice. God loves a cheerful giver, he announced. And the more you give, the more you receive. Who among you will sow a seed of N5 million today? Applause echoed. Ushers passed around velvet offering bags. The choir sang about abundance and favor. Wealth was no longer a testimony. It was the gospel itself. Just then, the church doors creaked open, heads turned. A man walked in slowly, leaning on a cane. His clothes were old and stained. His sandals were worn out. A faded cap covered his head. His eyes, however, were sharp, watching everything. It was Chief Maid in disguise. He made his way to a side bench away from the spotlight. Daniel followed silently behind, posing as a humble assistant. My wonderful viewers, before we dive back into the story, if you're enjoying this story, please show some love. Hit that like button and tell us in the comments where in the world are you watching from. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Yes, you. Because every click, every comment, every subscription keeps this story fire burning. Now, let's return to the story. Father Frank glanced at them once and immediately frowned. He leaned toward one of the ushers and whispered, "Who let those beggars in here?" "They just walked in, sir," the usher replied nervously. "Well, walk them out. This isn't a refugee camp. This is God's sanctuary, not a garbage bin." The usher hesitated, but Father Frank raised his voice. "You, old man with the cane," he barked. The music stopped. Everyone turned. "Did you lose your way? The beggars' center is down the street." The disguised billionaire didn't respond. "You must be mad to walk in here like that," Father Frank continued. "Do you want to bring curses into God's house with your poverty?" Soft laughter rippled through the congregation. Someone even took a picture. Chief Maddle stood up, his hands trembling. "I thought this was a place for the broken," he said quietly, "but it seems only the beautiful are allowed to worship here." Father Frank scoffed. "God deserves honor, not pity parties. Please leave before you defile the altar." The old man turned and walked out slowly. Outside, he leaned on his cane and looked up at the sky. "So, it's true," he said to Daniel. "This church isn't about God, it's about gold." 3 weeks later, news broke across social media. Billionaire Chief Bedell donates entire estate to orphanage after church rejects him. Reveals he visited churches in disguise. God lives among the humble, not the proud, he says before death. The article included photos, one of a glowing orphanage receiving the check and another of the priest pointing at a disguised Bamiel in church. Church members were stunned. That was him. Papa chased away a billionaire. He could have changed everything here. The priest panicked. He tried to spin the story during Sunday service. "Do not be deceived," he shouted from the pulpit. "The devil disguises himself as an angel of light." That man was not sent by God, but the people were no longer clapping. They were quiet, ashamed. A group of elders confronted him after the service. "Enough is enough," one said. "You have turned God's house into a circus." Another added, "You humiliated a widow until she died. You humiliated a dying billionaire who came to give. What else have you done behind closed doors?" Soon a petition began. Then a protest. Then the council met. In less than a month, Father Frank was stripped of his title and removed from the church. The once golden cathedral was now empty. A cold monument to pride, greed and a dream corrupted. The once vibrant cathedral that echoed with choirs, clapping and cheers now stood eerily silent. Dust had begun to gather on the pulpit. The golden offering bowls were untouched. The car park, once filled with SUVs and convoys, sat empty like a ghost town. Even the wind that whistled through the compound seemed to be mourning something long dead. Reverend Father Frank sat in his private residence, a luxurious house built behind the church with funds he once claimed were seed offerings. His white robe was crumpled, his once glowing skin pale with worry. He hadn't slept well since the news broke. What disturbed him most wasn't the scandal, nor the shame. It was the silence. No one came to see him, not even the rich families he once elevated. The phone stopped ringing. The loyal members who once knelt to greet him now crossed the road when they saw him. He had become a public disgrace. He stared at a photo on his wall, a younger version of himself in priestly robes, smiling brightly on the day of his ordination. The dream was pure back then, or so he thought. He remembered the moment the old priest laid hands on him and said, "Serve God with a clean heart." He hadn't listened. Meanwhile, in the community, it was a strange Sunday. For the first time in years, the church was open, but without a priest. A humble assistant pastor, Brother Nathaniel, had been asked to lead the morning devotion. He wasn't eloquent. He wasn't rich, but his eyes were kind. About 30 people came, mostly those who had left the church when it became a den of showmanship. Among them were tailor, market women, bus drivers, and street cleaners. Some sat quietly in the back rows, afraid. Others hesitated at the door. Brother Nathaniel stood at the altar and cleared his throat. "I know many of you are hurting," he began. "You were shamed. You were overlooked. You were told your clothes, your car, your offering wasn't good enough for God." He paused, then continued. "But God never asked for gold. He asked for a humble heart, a broken spirit, and a willing soul." One by one, people began to cry. Not loudly, just silent tears of cleansing. The widow's story had shaken them deeply. Her photo had gone viral. Standing at the altar with her two dry yams, smiling. That smile haunted many. A smile that hid pain. A smile that was mocked, then silenced. A middle-aged woman raised her hand. "I was once told not to sing in the choir because my voice wasn't rich enough," she said, her voice shaking. "I left the church for years." A man stood up. "I was a cleaner, and one Sunday I came in my work uniform. The priest told the ushers to move me to the back. That day, I stopped believing in the church." Story after story followed. People who were bruised, overlooked, and spiritually wounded by the very place meant to be their refuge. But something was shifting. They had returned, not for the man who fell, but for the God who remained. Late one night, Frank walked to the church alone. His steps were unsure, his heart heavy. He stood before the altar, now stripped of its ornaments, and fell to his knees. "God," he whispered. "I don't even know where to begin. I thought I was serving you, but I was serving myself." He wept. Not performative tears, but the kind that burns your soul. "I used your name to fill my stomach. I used your altar to build my image. I mocked your children. I disgraced your house. How do you even look at me?" The silence was loud. But in that silence, something began to shift inside him. Not an answer, but an awareness. A mirror to see himself clearly. He remembered Madame Grace's face, that smile, that kindness. He had mocked it. He had called her a witch. He had driven her out to her death. His voice cracked as he said her name aloud. "I'm sorry, Madame Grace." The next Sunday, something strange happened. Father Frank walked into the church not in his robe, but in simple plain clothes. He didn't go to the pulpit. He sat at the back alone. Gasps rippled through the congregation. Some stood, some whispered. Brother Nathaniel noticed, paused his teaching, then said, "We are all sinners in need of grace. Let him sit." After service, Frank walked to the altar and asked for the microphone. It was silent. He stood trembling. "I don't expect your forgiveness," he began. "I don't deserve it, but I must confess." And he did. He confessed everything. The bribes, the manipulation, the pride, the lies, the obsession with riches, the humiliation of the widow, the billionaire, the innocent. He didn't try to make excuses. He didn't try to look holy. He just emptied himself. People wept again, not out of pain this time, but out of release. Healing had begun. One old man walked up to him and placed a hand on his shoulder. "God gives grace to the humble," he said gently. Others joined in slowly, one by one, until a crowd surrounded Clement, not to praise him, but to pray for him. 6 months later, the church that once bore the nickname, the rich man's church, was barely recognizable. Not because of the building. The walls were the same. The marble floors remained untouched, and the golden pulpit still stood, but because the spirit had changed. Gone were the velvet ropes that separated the important from the ordinary. Gone were the designer chairs reserved for wealthy families. There were no more announcements of who gave the highest offering. There were no favors, no titles, and no pride parading itself before the cross. Now ushers smiled at everyone the same. Children from poor homes ran up and down the aisles with laughter. And for the first time in years, strangers didn't feel like outcasts. They felt like family. At the entrance of the church, where posters once advertised Harvest Gala and Millionaire Seed Night, now stood a large wooden sign beautifully engraved. God looks at the heart, not the garment. 1 Samuel 16 verse 7. Inside the church, a large portrait had been placed near the altar. It showed a smiling old widow holding 2 small tubers of yam. Beneath it were the words, "In memory of Madame Grace, the woman who reminded us what true worship looks like." Father Frank was no longer a priest, not officially. After his removal, the Dacis stripped him of his position, and rightly so. But he didn't leave the city. He chose to stay to serve in silence. He now worked with the church janitorial team, cleaning the very halls where he once strutted in designer robes. He washed toilets, swept the compound, and arranged chairs every Sunday morning before the new pastor arrived. People were stunned the first few weeks. Some thought he was faking humility. Others kept their distance. But time revealed what words could not. Frank had changed. He no longer demanded to be seen or heard. He no longer flinched at the sight of poverty. In fact, he now spent most of his time helping the poor, visiting sick members, and using what little savings he had to fund scholarships for children in the community. He would often be seen sitting quietly in the last row, a Bible on his lap. His head bowed, not in shame, but in reverence. One evening, the church received a letter addressed to the redeemed people of God. It was from Daniel, the young secretary of Chief Mattel, who had accompanied him that fateful day. It read, "Before Chief Baymittle passed, he asked me to write this on his behalf." He forgave the priest. He understood what pain and ambition can do to the human soul when left unchecked. He chose not to condemn, but to inspire. He asked me to tell the church, "Be the kind of place that welcomes the stranger, the broken, the poor, and the rich alike, because God sees beyond the mask." I came to give, but I found something deeper than charity. I found truth, and that is what we must never lose again. 1 year later, it was Thanksgiving Sunday again. But this time, no spotlights, no gold-plated chairs, just a full church singing with one voice. From the shoemaker in the back to the business woman in the front, everyone brought something. One boy brought a bag of Gary. An old woman brought oranges. A bus driver brought his time. A child brought a song. And nobody laughed. Nobody whispered. Everyone worshipped. The choir sang, "Come as you are, broken and whole. Your rags are welcome, your tears consoled. This is a house not built by pride, but by the love of Christ inside." And at the very front sat Brother Nathaniel, now officially ordained as the lead pastor. He preached about justice, humility, mercy, and forgiveness. Then at the end of the service, he looked toward the back and smiled. "Brother Clement," he said. "Please come forward." Gasps filled the room. Frank rose slowly, nervous. No titles, Nathaniel added. Just a servant of God. Frank walked to the altar and was handed a small gift, a Bible with a gold edge. We don't reward you for your past, but we honor the journey you've taken. Let this be a reminder that God can raise even the fallen if they repent and return with truth. Tears filled Clement's eyes. He held the Bible close to his chest and whispered, "Thank you, Lord." Final words. The church had been broken. The priest had fallen. A widow had died. A billionaire had passed. But through the pain, something greater had risen. A community awakened, a truth restored, and a reminder that the church is not for the proud, but the humble. And so, the story of a poor boy who became a priest for riches became the story of a broken man who became a servant for God. And the biggest lesson of all, God is not mocked. What we sow, we reap. But if we turn back, truly turn, His mercy is still greater than our mistakes. Thank you for watching. I hope you learned one or two lessons from this story. See you in our next video. Kindly like, comment, share and subscribe.